Nature, Knowledge and Development, Critical Essays on Environmental History of India, New Delhi 2016, and Prabhuddha Bharat, Understanding Ambedkar in the Passage of Time, Kolkata, The Asiatic Society, August 2020, both edited volumes, a felicitation volume in 2 parts for Professor Binoy Bhushan Chaudhary, edited in entitled In the Quest of the Historian's Craft, Essays in honor of Professor B.B. Chaudhary, Part 1, The Economy, and Part 2, The Polity, Society, and Culture.
রিস্টার্ট করতে হবে রিস্টার্ট করতে হবে আবার
চলো
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম এক মিনিট
বলছি স্যার কি হ্যাং হয়ে গেছেন?
এক মিনিট
স্যারের ভিডিওটা দেখো তো, চেক করো তো।
হ্যাঁ দেখছি ম্যাম দেখছি স্যার।
ওকে স্যার, ঠিক আছে
ম্যাম আপনি এবার শুরু করুন। ম্যাম শুরু করুন।
Okay. A very good evening to you all. On behalf of the Department of History, Rabindra Bharati University, we welcome you to our second lecture in the Weblecture series on new perspectives in South Asian history, and we are privileged to have Professor Arun Bandopadhyay to deliver a talk on the relevance of economic history today. Professor Arun Bandopadhyay served as Nurul Hasan Chair Professor of History and Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Calcutta. Later, he worked as the ICSSR Senior Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. He is currently Historical and Archaeological Secretary at the Asiatic Society, Kolkata. He previously taught at Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, and Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan, and served as visiting fellow in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and later in Pari and Uppsala University, Sweden. His research interest covers a wide range of areas: agrarian history, business history, and history of science and environment. His published works include The Story of Jessop, Calcutta 1988, The Agrarian Economy, History of Gun and Shell Factory, Kosipur, 200 Years of Ordnance Factories Production in India, New Delhi 2002, Tribes, Forest and Social Formation in Indian History, edited with B.B. Chaudhary, New Delhi 2004, Science and Society in India, 1750 to 2000, New Delhi 2010, and 6 volumes of documents on economic history of British rule in India, focusing on Eastern India and Southern India in the late 19th century, all co-edited with Professor Amir Kumar Bakshi, New Delhi 2009, 2011, 2015, and 17. 2 of his latest books are entitled Nature, Knowledge and Development, Critical Essays on Environmental History of India, New Delhi 2016, and Prabhuddha Bharat, Understanding Ambedkar in the Passage of Time, Kolkata, The Asiatic Society, August 2020, both edited volumes, a felicitation volume in 2 parts for Professor Binoy Bhushan Chaudhary, entitled In Quest of the Historian's Craft, Essays in honor of Professor B.B. Chaudhary, Part 1, The Economy, and Part 2, The Polity, Society and Culture, edited by Arun Bandopadhyay and Sanjukta Dasgupta, New Delhi 2018. He was also the Secretary of the Indian History Congress 2009 and is currently 2009 to 2012, and is currently the President of the Society for Preservation, Calcutta. Over to you, sir. The platform is yours.
Thank you all, particularly for the kind introduction that you have made. I do not know that whether I deserve for this or not, but I will begin with my gratefulness to Rabindra Bharati University, the History Department in particular, the faculty. Many of the members of the faculty were my former students. Some of them were also my near students. I could find some of them over my laptop here, their faces. And I am sure that there are some people who are actually listening to this program in the YouTube, and many of them also are my students, colleagues, and friends. Now, I understand that this is the second of the RBU that they are now making about the new perspectives in history. The first lecture was given by my friend Professor Deepak Kumar, and this is the second one. But while selecting the theme of this presentation, I took some liberty with the HOD of History Department, who was also my former student, and I asked her to select the theme. I gave 3 themes, and she selected the theme. It is somewhat mysterious that why she selected it. It gave me a certain kind of jubilation because of the fact that I began as an economic historian and I'm still doing some sort of economic history. Indeed, while Sahara was presenting that kind of work that I'm now doing with Professor Amiya Kumar Bakchi, she has mentioned about this Eastern India and Southern India. But on Northern India also, we have published 3 volumes this year with Amiya Kumar Bakchi. And today I got a phone call that 3 more volumes, the manuscript of which 600 pages each, have come for me to correct the proof. So this is a huge work that they're trying to do. And but I understand this is a mysterious thing that why is this selected that I should talk about economic history as such. Maybe that she knew that, and many of you knew that this was my continuous love, though I later on worked on history of science and history of environment, history of forestry, etc. And it may be that, like Sahara, many of you belong to the second generation, middle age generation, like Shusnato, like Ajanta, like Shubhabrata, maybe more younger, Anuradha, and many others, those people who actually work in the Rabindra Bharati University and elsewhere, the middle-aged generation of historians who have heard that economic history had its height at once upon a time, and later on, for some reasons, there was certain signs of criticism, certain signs of decline, certain signs of disinterest in it. And though at the same time, there were certain attempts were also made from that time onwards down to the present day for its rehabilitation. Indeed, I will actually argue here that if any particular decade is to be selected for the height of the economic study of economic history, as well as for the first onslaught against the economic history, as well as certain kinds of rethinking on economic history, this is all 1970s, that particular decade. So I will first of all concentrate myself on the state of economic history around the 1970s. As I told you, that this is because that decade was the height, that decade was also the first criticism against economic history, and that decade also suggests certain ideas about its rehabilitation. Now I will tell you a story, several stories, and certain stories are personal stories in the sense that I have heard it and I have tried to verify it in my own way. First, I will tell you the story, personal story of Professor N.K. Sinha. You know that Professor N.K. Sinha in this part of India, Bengal proper, he was one of the most important persons who actually initiated the study of economic history in a big way. So he was not an economic historian in the very beginning, and it was from the 1940s onwards that he started it. And his last volume of Economic History of Bengal, Volume 3, was published in 1970, a year after he retired from the University of Calcutta as a associate professor. I have a story. The story is this: that Professor K.N. Chaudhary, P.T. Narayan Chaudhary, who was also one of the sons of the famous Nilotsi Chaudhary, who was at that time was young lecturer at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and he met N.K. Sinha in 1970, and he told him that all history can be quantified. because an economic historian and even history of ideas can be quantified. N.K. Sinha was changing over time. Indeed, when he was writing the preface of Volume 3 in Economic History of Bengal, he was saying that he no longer believed in counterfactuals, etc., etc. And he was a sort of a historian who studied records, both qualitative and quantitative. So it attracted him, and someone told me that N.K. Sinha has said this. N.K. Sinha died in 1974. I was not at that time in Kolkata. I was at that time working in Madras for my research. In 2001, when I met Ken Chaudhuri in London, I verified this story. And Ken Chaudhuri at that time has changed. But he still believed that quantification is important and all history can be quantified. But at the time he has left SOAS, he has taken up other subjects like the history of music, influence, and history of binding. But his love for economic history did not diminish. So, even in 2001, K. Chaudhuri was defending quantification and quantified history. My own personal study somehow in research was in the form of my search in quantified economic history in my own way, and I will not go in details to that. And whatever criticism, whatever appreciation I have got because of my first economic work in sense, nobody has said that it has no quantified basis. But the more important point is this, that something more important things were happening throughout the world at that time. I was not fully aware of all these things. Later on, I became aware of it. One of these things is this. In 1974, in the year in which I first started my archival work in the Tamil Nadu archives, it was in the same year the book was published in the United States. And that book actually made big history. And the book's authors was Robert Fogel and Stanley Engelman. And the book was called Time on the Cross, The Economics of American Negro Slavery. This was the book. And two main themes that book had. One theme is this, the division of the history of slavery. And second was the use of the quantified method in history. These were the two very important aspects of that book. Indeed, these two persons, Fogel and Engelman, used computer as much as they were available in the early 1970s in a big way in this. One of the main conclusion of Fogel in that book was that slavery was profitable in southern states of United States, southern states of the United States. And there are many people who are against slavery, obviously. And another thing was this, that if you have to follow this quantified method. Once the book was published, there was great criticism of that book. The New York Times literary supplement made a very critical appreciation of that book. And he was attacked also, because one of the statements was that the free labor that were working in the north and the slave labor that were working in the south, the living condition of the slave labor was somewhat better. Now, for long, this criticism went on. Very few people knew that his lifetime was 1926 to 2013. Very few people knew that Fogel wrote certain other books. And very few people knew that Fogel was not a supporter of slavery. Fogel was only saying this, that slavery was not unprofitable in the southern states, that coming from the quantified reports of it. And later on, with another person, Douglas North, who also actually an economic historian, both of them are from economics department, came to economic history. Douglas North, whose lifetime is from 1920 to 2015, he also wrote a very important book on the institutional history of Economic History. Very important book. And both of them were given Nobel Prize in 1993. In economics, of course, but actually it is on economic history. I don't know that any other Nobel Prize was given at any time on economic history. This is for the first time that Nobel Prize was given to these two persons for the contribution in economics, but actually in economic history. Now, what I wanted to clarify here, because all these things happened in the 1970s, that the major work of Vogel and Engelmann, as well as Douglas North, occurred in the 1970s. Douglas North worked on institutions and institutional change in American economic growth occurred in 1971. But very few people know that Vogel later on wrote two other important books. One is this, Without Consent and Contrast, Rise and Fall of American Slavery in 1989, the Fourth Great Awakening in 2000. In both these works, actually Vogel categorically stated that he was very much against slavery, but slavery has to be opposed on the point of view of moral grounds. And evangelicism and as well as egalitarianism are the two things on which he based his arguments. So in other words, the main accusation against Vogel, as well as actually such accusation cannot be done against Douglas North, because Douglas North was not making this kind of things. Indeed, he was talking about the institutional history. I will talk about it later on. Institutional history means that when you do this kind of economic studies or any other kind of studies, you think of certain institutions like property, like for example, government policy, other things, which are institutions. And without the study of institutions, economic history cannot be done. So it was not a very narrow-minded economic history at all, as far as Douglas North was concerned. And though Vogel was generally accused for his quantitative method cleometrician, he was called the R-cleometrician, and all the faults of cleometricians actually occurred in Vogel. And but the fact is this, that when he wrote about the rise and fall of American slavery in 1989, he was categorically clear that only on moral grounds it has to be opposed, and not on this kind of ground that whether it is profitable or not. And if you want to do that, you have to go through the documents. I am not going into the details of whether that particular quantitative method was correct or not. That is to say, to argue that slavery was profitable in the southern states of the United States. But the fact is this, that he was talking about the moral grounds, he was talking about the evangelicalism, and he was talking about the role of the religious reformers, and he was talking about the moral grounds. So economic history, it was narrow, all these things, even in the height of the 1970s, it does not stand. Now, I will go back to a little earlier, when economic history was rising throughout the world, particularly in Europe, in the early decades of the 20th century. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I will now come to a person whose name is R.H. Tony. R.H. Tony who was born in 1880 in India. His father was a Sanskrit scholar, but his all education went on in England, and he became a graduate of Oxford University in 1904, and then in 1916 he wrote a book called Agrarian Problem of the 16th Century, and later on he was a very peculiar person. He was a very good student, but he started to teach the working class children in the university education, educational subjects he used to teach, and he became a member of the Labour Party, but he could not win. 3 times he actually stood for the Labour Party, but he actually was defeated. But when he was given a very clear, very good seat, he refused to do that. Later on, he joined London School of Economics and he became a professor there. In 1926, R.H. Tawney wrote a book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Indeed, it was a sort of an extension and sort of a correction of the earlier book by famous Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The German edition was published in 1904 and it was translated by no less a person than Calcutta Parsons in English in 1930. That means when Tawney wrote that book, no English translation was available. And in that book, actually, you know that in Max Weber's main argument was this, that there were certain things in Protestant ethics, particularly the notion of predestination, which actually made an ambience during which actually the spirit of capitalism could develop. So the spirit of capitalism, which was apparently an economic one, that had its other kind of root, sociological root, and he actually got it from religion. But R.H. Tawney actually slightly changed it in the sense that he said that it is the Calvinism particularly, which was responsible for this, and Calvinists actually were taught in such a way which does not approve of the acquisition society that capitalism actually fosters. Indeed, his more popular of Tawney was the Acquisitive Society, which was published just 100 years ago, 1920. Acquisitive Society. And he was always a member of the church, and he was not always a practitioner of, but a member of the church, and he tried to argue in this way. And it suggests that this book is a classic one, and this book actually, it is stated that this book actually made what economic history is all about. So in 1926, religion and the rise of capitalism made what it is to be all about it. And there, actually, Tawney argued that it was the individualism and the ethic of hard work and thrift of Calvinist Protestantism that had fostered industrial capitalism and its efficient workforce throughout Northern Europe. He was a disciple of Weber, but he actually received from him, and he extended his argument. Former's ideological argument, as I told you, was that it was rooted in predestination. He was not actually fully supporting it. He was more or less actually giving his argument around Calvinism. Now, why I am focusing Tawney in 2020? Because of the fact that it is just to highlight that economic history in its heydays was focusing other factors than the ones merely economic ones, and an altogether different explanation of the long-term changes was given by some of the brightest economic historians at the very beginning when the economic history was rising in Europe. That was the situation in 1920s, 1930s, 40s. This was during that time. The other great economic historian who developed was Eric Hobsbawm, and you know that Eric Hobsbawm also in 1971, in the 100th edition of Daedalus, wrote a very important article whose name was From Social History to History of Society. And in that book, he made a very, very distinct proposition. The proposition is this, that all history is social, including political, economic, all history is social. And if we want to talk about some sort of a different kind of social history, which is sociology oriented, then we should call it as history of society. So that was a different proposition. So all history is social. Indeed, I must also tell you that that R.H. Tony was the founder of the Economic History Association in England. And R.H. Tony was also one of the joint editors of Economic History Review in England. And if you open up the first page of Economic History Review, then you'll find it is a journal of social and economic history. So that was the situation throughout economic history. But something happened in the 1970s. As a result, suddenly the criticism against economic history became very prominent. What was that event? Now I will come to that event. It will not, this argument will not just exhaust the history of new social history, because in the 1970s, what we are talking about was the new social history. And the new social history, much part of new social history was based on economic history. And new social history was actually developing in three very important countries: United States, United Kingdom, and France. They have taken different routes, of course. In the United States, it took because of the rising prestige of the sociology department throughout the 1950s, 60s, that sociological study-oriented history actually was becoming more and more important. In the United Kingdom, it was the contribution of some of the brilliant writers of history, and some of them were actually Marxists, like Christopher Hill, like Eric Hobsbawm, and like, of course, Thompson, mixed the English working class. So that was England. And in France, you know that there was actually a different route, and this route actually started with the blessings of Marc Bloch and Lucien Favre in the 1920s and 30s. From the 1950s, came in the hands of such luminaries of historians like Fernand Braudel and Emmanuel Leray-Ladurie. So there are many in France, but they were not. Their actually question of Marxism, non-Marxism was not that important in France. In the United Kingdom, it was very important because the Marxist historians are not given good positions at all. Eric Hobsbawm had to work in Birkbeck College, and he was not given any place in Oxford or Cambridge University. This was the situation. Now, it was in the 1970s, people were working in such a way that everybody was arguing that actually we have to be more exact, more quantified, and we will ask for all sorts of information, all sorts of life, and we will not ignore, of course, the economic life, but we shall add other lives also. But there will be a quantified attempt to that. Economic history was actually supporting this. It was during this time that suddenly, from the middle of the 1970s, that cultural history became important, and there it was talked about that whether it is new social history or whether it is economic history of the world at any time, these are very narrow. This cannot cover the human experience, the human reality at all. So we have to come to culture, and in this attempt, there are many historians, and I will particularly refer to one historian whose name is William Sewell, who was actually called Junior because his father was also William Sewell, whose father was a famous sociologist of the Wisconsin University of the 1950s and 60s. He learned sociology at the feet of his father, but he was a person who had his French encounter and all the readings in the French history, and his first MA thesis was on Marc Bloch, and later on he worked on the French working class on the basis of the new social history methods. Much of it was economic, but in the middle of the 1970s, when cultural history was becoming very prominent, he actually gradually became interested in it. Though his thesis was on this. He did not publish it. He published another kind of thesis where actually his profession's other sides were talked about, like their taste, like their other kind of hobbies, all these kind of things. That is more important. And Sewell's example is important because Sewell actually became a participant of this cultural history, and then later on, when he wrote 2005, he became a critic of it. Now, if I go to the major argumentative position of this cultural school, then you will find that there are 2-3 types of influences were there. One is the influence of cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology became so prominent that suddenly that everything was, that Clifford Geertz and others, they were talking about it. And indeed, William Sewell himself was in the Chicago days, actually was collaborating with Clifford Geertz. They had a very important seminar in 1976 in which all these people, these economists, political scientists, anthropologists, and historians were called in, and this kind of discussion was going on. And in the 1980s, we found the sudden influence of textual studies and the rise of gender studies. And the root of the gender studies was also based on mostly based on textual studies. And this textual studies sometimes actually does not take any note of what happened beyond the text. They said that there is everything in the text. So this is a very, very important one. Go to the text and don't go beyond the text. And finally, there came the extreme argument that social structure was only a state of mind. And it is the product of the structuralism, debates on structuralism and post-structuralism. But social structure, it is not reality, it is a state of mind only. So that was the extreme position that the cultural historians took. And if that position was taken, then there is no new social history, no new economic history, nothing, because everything is in mind. So though there are very important benefits of cultural studies, but when it went to that extent, there was certain kind of reaction. And this reaction came in the 1990s and in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. That is to say, the first decade in which Sewell's book appeared, and the second decade at the end of which we got COVID-19, the great pandemic in the history of the world. So 1990s and the last 20 years of the 21st century actually was marked by certain things. For example, one point is this, that when the new social history became prominent in the 1960s and 1970s, all those people who became actually very important participant of it, they were a certain kind of progressive in the sense that they were participating in the human rights agitation, they were civil rights agitation of Martin Luther, and also they were actually critics of Fordism. Fordism was something which was a great leveler, so they were against it. But gradually, this type of very important ideological position that the new social history were taking was going to the background in the height of the cultural history, and we came to a position, we came to a situation in which actually we are almost arguing from a vacuum, and as a result, we did not know that great impact that globalization from the 1990s and its impact that made in the historical studies. We have heard of Acquisitive Society of R.H. Tony, published in 1920, but we do not know the monopoly of acquisition that went on during the last decade of the 20th century and in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, when we find that in spite of the pandemic and the poverty of people and the poverty of economy, that richer men are becoming richer, rich men are becoming richer. It's a very interesting thing. Rich men are becoming richer, and the entire economy is declining. So that is another thing. And as a result of this, the multinationals and the changing framework, both in the WTO days, when actually it was first formulated, and in the post-WTO days, when those people who formulated WTO ideas, now they are deviating from it. And they're saying that you cannot enter the United States and can sell your product like this. So WTO was a very, very like discriminatory interventions. The Sabusati Bhattacharya, you talked about the tariff policy of India's financial history. It was like this. But WTO, but it's for our benefit, not your benefit. So like this. And postmodernism had certain kind of positive features, certain kind of light, certain kind of darkness. Darkness in the sense when all cultural studies minus socio-economic studies. Cultural studies actually supplemented by the socio-economic studies, it has one kind of impact. But cultural studies without any supplementation, socio-economic studies is another kind of thing. Now, in this context, I will now argue. I have not much time because I started around 5:30, so I told that I will talk about 40 minutes, 10 minutes time. So I will now come to the very important thing of, as a result of all these things, actually how the economic history now can be studied. So that so much of historiographical change has taken place, so much of economic change has taken place. So certain methodological aspects are there, and we are not saying that we are in the same position where we were there in 1904, 1926, 1956, or 1974. So there are three things on which we should draw our attention, and these three things are actually historiographical things, but they can be applied to in order to reappraise economic history and its relevance to. These three things are: one is this facts, second is this meanings, and third is this interpretation. Now, as far as the facts are concerned, we know that there is a lot of philosophical understanding, and there is a disciplinary defense of facts. There is whether what kind of historical facts that we are talking about, what kind of economic fact that we are talking about, and this challenges modernism, challenges of postmodernism is this, that facts are not facts, they are fragments. And Collingwood's fact was also an event which is also an reenactment of the thought of the agent in mind, etc. But at the end of the day, do facts exist or not? That is the question. And I think whether we study economic history or any kind of history, we just cannot ignore that there are facts, and whatever kind of their implications, whatever kind of our discovery, there are facts, and these facts are to be properly understood. This is one thing. Second thing is meanings. And here a little new part of it, and it came from the cultural history, where actually the linguistic turn was made. And here the historians' increasing attention was given to it in the 1980s and 1990s, identification of cultural aspect of everything and the orthodoxy of the discourse. And when the discourse became very orthodox, then it came to the position that all history is either pronounced or hidden text. There's nothing beyond the text. So we cannot subscribe to this. We will also talk about meanings, as we also talk about facts, economic fact. And when economic fact is before us, we'll talk about their meanings. But we just cannot say that these meanings are merely understanding text, whether it is pronounced or hidden. And finally, interpretation. Interpretation is an exercise with familiarity with the past and present, subjective and objective element in it. Many possibilities are there. The innovative aspects of the history should know the emphasis on interpretation is based on whatever you understand and whatever
Sir,
you
your audio is getting disconnected, sir. Getting disconnected, sir.
No, sir. No, sir.
Now it's better. It's better now, sir. It's better. It's better.
It is better. Okay. So what I'm trying to point out is that facts, things, and interpretation, we have to recognize that there are certain facts, maybe our selection of it, as far as economic history is concerned, we watch what that means. We go to merely textual meanings.
It's still a bit disturbed, sir. Sir, it's, sorry to interrupt you. It's still a bit disturbed.
Also, in lost connection.
Yes. Better now, sir. Better.
Okay. So these three things are very important facts. So this is the thing. Now I will end this discussion by going through certain kind of illustrations. Illustration is very important. One illustration is this: that when the economic debates were going on, whether in India or throughout the world, one economic debate was like this, which occurred about the nature of the 19th century. It occurred between the famous economic historian Maurice de Morris. And Maurice de Morris was a colleague of Douglas North also. Douglas North, who got the Nobel Prize along with Vogel, and three doctors. And there also we found that the debate is actually on facts. Debate is actually on meanings. The debate is actually on interpretation. So we just cannot say that that it has no relevance in economic history. For example, what is the nature of development? It was the question of meaning. And what is the fact? Whether India was underdeveloped in 1800 or not? This fact. Because Maurice de Morris was saying that it was underdeveloped, and whatever development took place between 1800 and 1947. And others were arguing that no, India was not underdeveloped in 1800, and the pace of development was very slow. And meanings, what kind of time is required for the breakthrough, for the gestation? There is 150 years or 10, 20, 50 years. So that was another thing. And there was, of course, the question of interpretation. And similarly, we can also talk about the great question of poverty, scarcity, and famine, whatever debates were going on in India during the 19th century as well as in the 20th century. And all these things are also actually surrounding about the confusion about the fact, meanings, and interpretation, multiplicity of famines, etc. And also we find that there is very big difference between scarcity and famine in the British rule, during British rule. Why? And finally, also we find that if we actually include forest in it, we find that, and if Vinita Damodaran's actually we find that as long as the forest laws were not imposed, actually famine's impact in the forest villages were less. When the forest laws were imposed very strongly after 1970s and 1980s, 1870s and 1880s, then actually the impact was greater in the forest of the famine. Similarly, we can talk about the living standards, the great debate that was going on in England, and the debate between Hobsbawm, the so-called optimist and pessimist, and some of the pessimists like Hobsbawm were also actually following the quantified method. And there are actually the division between the two groups, quantifiers and the qualifiers. And you know that Thompson's great great criticism about these quantifiers, about the economic history, etc., etc. But the fact is, this economic history review, actually, one of the joint editors was no person than this R.H. Tony, once upon a time. So this is a situation in which in the living standard, ultimately quantity question and quality question came, and there actually it actually it enriched the entire discussion in such a way that later on welfare economics was based on it, and much later, after I think about 75 years after Pigu's work, Amartya Sen was given his Nobel Prize in 1990 welfare economics. But Pigu started the discipline of welfare economics in 1924. And this was actually based on economic history. Again, as I told you, Douglas North, for example, he was talking about that whether the economists are mostly concerned about theory, and he was saying that if we do not base our theory on the long-term economic change, which is based on economic history, our theory would be meaningless. So political, very, very important thing in the study of political economy, economic history was most important. And we can talk about the long-term economic change, why poor countries remain poor, why the rich countries became richer, all these questions, long-term changes. And this has been done by certain people in the West, and people like Amiya Kumar Bagchi. The Perilous Passage is a critique of the history of the global history of the last 500 years, where actually this has been shown that it was not a decided thing. The Western countries will only be richer. There are many possibilities. The possibilities were lost. Why they are lost, we have to search. And finally, I will end with the question of economy and dynamics that we are being now placed. And there also you will find that the main question, if we can sum up the main question, whether the problem is virological or economic. The point is this, that we just cannot say that it is only economic. We also just cannot say it is only virological. And more important than this is that even the virological part cannot be properly understood without the economics of it. So, in other words, economic history in the extended sense of the term is very, very relevant today. Very, very relevant today. It was relevant today, more relevant today probably in the wake of globalization that took place from the 1990s onwards. And if we ask me to draw conclusions of this lecture, I will say this thing. As I told you, that my talk will start from the 1970s, which actually was personally very important to me, because my research career was actually shaped in that decade. But 1970 is a distant decade for many who were the middle-aged generation of historians, and for you that it was an heyday of economic history at that time, but it declined after that. So my conclusion is this, that much of the deformation of economic history in the 1970s was a misconception. This is first one. Second is this, the whatever kind of banishment of economic history that was occurred after 1970s, throughout 1980s and 1990s, it was temporary. And third is this, like all living disciplines, the frontiers of economic history is always still expanding, as it was earlier also expanding. And as a result, I find that there are very important signs and very important scope of a reappearance and reappraisal of economic history, study of economic history and its relevance today. So these are certain broad conclusions from my talk, and I end here. I am sorry that there are certain disturbances where I was talking. I'm sorry that it took a little longer, but I started a little later also. So I probably didn't bore you for a long time. And if there are any observations, some questions, if I can answer, I will answer. If I cannot, I will throw it to yourselves. that these are the questions, and these may be the possible answers. But I admit, I will admit defeat. I cannot answer your question. If such things. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for such an interesting lecture. It was actually, I felt like walking down memory lane again, and I was back to your classroom listening to your class lectures, and such a brilliant lecture, analytical, and has traced the development of the discipline for years that have that we have studied economic history. So I would just like to take a few questions, which I have already in my chat box. Is full of a few questions. So would I take the questions together, sir, or would you like to take it together, sir?
One. Two questions. You first say 10 and remember, because 5 questions I may forget.
Right, sir. Here's a question from Amrita Seth. She's asking, what do you think about business history in this context?
Oh, business history is very important. Sorry.
Yes, sir. Please go on.
Can I answer?
Yes, please go on.
Business history is a very important part of economic history. Indeed, I also, in my research career, did 2 special works which can be identified as business history. One is the story of Jessup, when the Jessup and Company, the first engineering company, actually celebrated its 200 years in 1988. I wrote that history, and later on, when 200 years celebrated the Kashipur Gun and Cell Factory, Government of India was appointing me to write a history of that. And there are many other kinds of business history. Business history can be like the Bart and Company, and like many other Martin and Company, and other companies, private companies, etc., etc. My teacher, Professor Amresh Tripathi, who actually was very much interested in business system, and later on he was not pursuing it because he found very difficult to get private papers of business houses. That is a difficulty. But the fact is, this history is a very important part of economic history. But the problem is that many of the documents of business history are not easily available. Even when I was doing the Jessup history, you know that there was the first scandal. A scandal in post-independent India was Mundra scandal, and the Mundra scandal in 1956 was connected to Jessup. And when I was looking to the minute books of Jessup, they told me, don't go beyond 1956. Actually, you should not go through the 1956 things. They did not allow me to go through that particular year's minute. So these are the problems. But throughout the world, if you take globally, business history is a very, very important area of economic history.
Right, sir. We have another question here from Sunaina Maiti. She's asking, today when we see the funds for social science research decreasing in the education budget, what, according to you, is the future of economic history in the history departments of our country?
No, if the funding for social science decreased, then all the subjects, from political science to economics to history, sociology, anthropology, all these things we affected. That is a very, very, very general one. Now, as far as economic history is concerned, the interest in economic history declined because of the attack of the cultural history to an extent, because of certain misconceptions to an extent, also the fact that some economic historians could not cope to the change in the way historical disciplines was changing, and also because of the fact that initially economic history was contributed by people coming from 2 disciplines, both history and economics. But gradually, from economic history, people are coming less and less in number. It has become more the area of historians, like also history of science, more the area of professional historians. And of course, we have to cope with the situation. We have to show that how economic history, like other history also, can be very relevant to our day-to-day life, and how the study can be not merely done on your academic interest in the narrow sense of the term, but also interest of our understanding of our evolution, understanding of our society, probably for giving us certain directions for the future.
Right, sir. We have another question. Sir, how would you address the changes in history writing of India? Probably he means the influence of economic history on the writing of history in India. This is from Arup Mitro.
It's a very, very important thing. Question. Economic history writing actually changed over time. Once upon a time, it was more or less the political history. And the political history also was merely a narration of dynasties, description of kings, and delineations of wars, as Rabindra Tagore was stating in his writing on Bharatbharsh Itihas, that students were actually memorizing the various kinds of Carnatic wars, which Carnatic wars took place at what time, etc., etc. But what is the implication of Carnatic wars, etc., etc. So we should know about it. And later on, this political history was mixed with certain degree of economic history and certain degree of social history, and much later, certain degree of cultural history. But take the example, for example, of even the syllabus of the school living students, class 10 syllabus. We have been now very generous. We know in that syllabus we have included history of sports, we have included, for example, history of films, we have included the history of arts, we have included the history of journalism, and you will find that if you any book on class 9, 10 standard, I have some experience because one of my relatives actually brought that book to me very recently. But you know that when you do all this kind of thing, unless and until you can give the broader socio-political, socio-economic political structure of the time, these are actually not only contextualized. So merely sports history, merely certain history of newspapers, merely certain history of films will not do unless and until we have that real historical sense. And that historical sense, the very basic part of it, comes from the socio-economic political structure. So unless and until you have an understanding of the socio-economic political structure, you don't understand culture, you don't understand sports, you don't understand films, you don't understand fine arts. Yes. I'm not ignoring all of them. They are very important. But they should be read in the real sense of the term, in the real meanings of them.
Right. We have another question from Shweta Mukherjee. She's asking, sir, did technology play any role in the economic history of the said period? Kindly, if you could illuminate on that part.
Yeah, you know that when you have heard of this word institutional history. Institutional history in the case of economic history. Now, what is institutional history? Douglas North, as I told you, actually argued in a big way. His book came in the 1971, as I told you, and when the Nobel Prize was given, actually they were actually wondering that some very important work was done in the 1970s in economic history. So in that year, 1993, they gave this prize to these two economists for their economic history writing, not for any other things. Now, Rita is asking that what is the role of technology? You know, you have heard of Veblen, a German history school. There are some certain economists who belong to certain schools. So in the German historical school, one of the very important proponents of economic thought in came from the historical school of Germany, and one of the main proponents of him was Veblen. Veblen first told us that technology can make the great difference. So technology is an institution. So if you study technology, you will study, and you will be able to study, you will be able to understand economic change and also long-term historical change. So here technology was a very, very important thing. Similarly, Marx has a different kind of ideas. There are others who had also many other kinds of ideas. So what I am trying to point out, there are many people who say that other institutions, like the institutions of property, for example, is a very important thing. Equity. Now, any economic historian cannot ignore that what the state is taking, what means the state is taking to the society more egalitarian, to make the society that, well, rich people can become richer, but poor people should not die. So this is a very, very important thing. And I think that one of the very important result, I think general universal result is this, that, for example, compare the kind of deaths that took place in Calcutta Street in 1943 and whatever famine took place in India after independence in recent years, scarcity famine, how many people died? Not that number. That many people died in 1943. Similarly, large number of people died in 1770 famine in Bengal. The Bengal famine was 1770. Because institution, multi-party system, multi-party political system, certain kind of democracy. One political party will argue that you cannot do this, whatever you do, etc. So all governments will try. All governments will try that they bring the best to help the poor. They cannot say this. But in 1943, nobody said this. In 1777, nobody said this. So large number of people died. Those ideas were not there. Those institutions were not there. So we cannot ignore institutions. When we talk about economic change, we talk about economic history. We cannot just discuss only markets. We cannot just discuss only about wages. There are many other things.
Right, sir. Actually, probably those are the questions I had from the chat box. Are there any more questions from my faculty members, from our faculty members of the department? I would just like to ask, sir, whether the contours of economic history have expanded itself into other domains. Has it blended with other areas? Is it because of that we see a decline in the study of economic history and interest in economic history?
Yes, it's an interesting, it's not a question, it's a suggestion probably. That, for example, when we study medicine, for example, because there is a saying that all those people who are doing very serious work in economic history, they are now doing the similar serious work on the, say, for example, history of medicine, or say, for example, history of technology, or for example, history of certain kind of other things like public health, etc., etc. But you will think that if you go through them, many of them actually are using economic history methods. Economic history methods was once upon a time a certain kind. One of the methods was quantification. It was not the only method. That was the main misconception of the 1970s. It went to that extent that the Great Criticism came. At that time, it was not thought that when economic history was born, it was born with the religion and rise of capitalism by Rich Tony, which was not merely a study of markets, which was not merely a study of industrial growth, which was actually a larger study of why capitalism grew and what was the role of religion, and particularly the Calvinist religion in it. So it was a larger study. You and us now can say that if there is an Aristotle nowadays, he will not use the word capitalism. He will say that this Calvinism and all this kind of thing, one kind of religious studies will be made, and actually all those arguments will be there. So in public health, in technology, in other kind of variological impact, or for example other kind of even in sports, for example, the economic part of it was very, very important. For example, why certain kind of sports becoming so much prevalent nowadays? One is cricket, not the cricket. So if we cannot include the economic part of it, you will not be able to explain it. So you may be saying that actually some of the economic history studies are now being done. Similar kind of studies now being done in various other sub branches, which is apparently prospering. But those sub branches, if they divorce themselves completely with economic history, they will not be able to prosper. And in fact, economic history is also explained.
Right, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for taking all those questions and answering them with great patience. I would now request Professor Anuradha Koyal to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Sahara. On behalf of the Department of History, Rabindra Bharati University, I thank Professor Arun Bandopadhyay for his thought-provoking talk. I thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Shobbosati Bosurai Chaudhuri, for his help and cooperation. I thank the Honorable Register, Professor Shubir Moitro. I also thank the Honorable Dean, Faculty of Arts, Professor Tarak Nath Adhikari. I thank the Head of the Department of History, Dr. Shahara Ahmed. I thank my esteemed colleagues. I thank the non-official staff of Rabindra Bharati University. I thank my students, and I also thank our scholar, Deepasha Dotto, for the technical help provided by her. Thank you.
The feedback form
Thank
will
you
be
all.
provided immediately, and it will be there for 10 minutes, a good 10 minutes. So you can just fill up the feedback form so that it helps us issue the certificates.
Ma'am,
Thank you
we'll
very
wait
much.
for 3 minutes, 3 or 5 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, we'll give 5 minutes. 5 minutes for the feedback
No,
forms.
ma'am, not for the feedback form. For the
Sorry?
streaming. Wait for 5 minutes.
For the
For
streaming.
the
Okay,
streaming.
streaming will continue for 5 minutes, and the feedback forms will be there. Kindly fill up the feedback form so that we can issue certificates to all the participants.
ম্যাম ওয়েট স্ট্রিমিং একটু লেটে চলছে তাই একটু ওয়েট করতে হবে আপনাকে ম্যাম ওয়েট Ma'am, everyone can leave, but you stay, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
ম্যাম আপনি মিউট।
সবাই চলে গেছে?
ম্যাম ডোন্ট
আমরা
সে,
চারজন
ম্যাম ডোন্ট সে এনিথিং।
ওকে।
Great.
হয়েছে?
ম্যাম ওয়েট।
মিউট করেছো?
ম্যাম দেখতে পাচ্ছেন লেটে চলছে।
হুম হুম।
ম্যাম আপনি ক্যামেরা অফ করে দিন আপাতত।
হুম, ক্যামেরা অফ করে দেবো?
চাইলে অফ করে দিতে পারেন, একটু ওয়েট করুন। ম্যাম এন্ড হয়ে গেছে।
হয়ে গেছে?